So today I have some material prepared where we can do a little bit of a review, but also mostly focus on coding style. So we can cover kind of what are the expectations that I've kind of scattered throughout the slides so far, but never kind of said these words in one place. So I thought this would be a good opportunity to do so. But before I get started with that, I'll make a couple announcements about class. And if there are any questions, feel free to put them in the chat so we can start with a batch of questions initially, go through the material I had prepared for the code along, and then see if there's any more questions at the end as well. So you will have seen that I have been kind of going through and uploading marks for your labs. Your lab 3 should be done a little bit later today as well. And going forward, we should be able to turn those around a bit quicker because now that the extension policies and stuff are in place, I know exactly what the parameters are for doing things. A few of you have asked numerous times, like if you're late and you can't push to your repo, unfortunately, GitHub doesn't have a great error. Like when you try to push, there's not a way for me to tell GitHub to tell you, you can't push because it's past the deadline. What it does is it tells you that repo doesn't exist. And the reason why it tells you it doesn't exist is because you don't have the right permissions at that time to be able to write to that repository. So if you've been working on your assignment for a while and then all of a sudden you can't anymore and you realize it's after the deadline, that's what it is. We've outlined the late policy on the course website, on the syllabus. So if something is due on a Thursday, you have until Tuesday for your homeworks to get it. If you can turn it in late with some penalty, or you can request an extension. I think the school guidelines is that your extension request has to come before the deadline. If it's like a illness and a special circumstance, then obviously there are different ways of going about it. So this is not to put you in a rough spot if there's genuinely something very serious going on with your health. But if it's more like, I could use a little bit more time, the school expects you to ask for that before the deadline, not after. And I can tell you, this is a bookkeeping nightmare. So this is not me complaining, it's just me telling you it is a bookkeeping nightmare. And so we have to have some policies in place. Otherwise, flexibility for one person can end up simply meeting delay of feedback for a whole group of people. And that's not entirely fair either. And so that's the thing. If you're trying to submit something late, you have to let me know. And then I'll give you the permissions. I'll make a note that that's what's happening, and then we'll handle it that way. Okay. I will say that when I uploaded marks yesterday for your lab 2, a few more of you than should have initially got zeros on Learn, which I fixed today. And the reason why I'm mentioning this is because there is a data science lesson to be taken away from it. So when you guys had submitted your GitHub usernames at the very beginning of the semester, before we even taught you anything about data, many of you were quite kind of careless, but not in a bad way, just careless about how you spell them. So for example, if something is a lowercase letter, you may have put it in an uppercase letter, and GitHub will like recognize those and will still match your name to you. But my code wasn't matching it. So there were a few students who got zeros because it looked like they had not made any commits, but actually they had, just with their lowercase name as opposed to uppercase. I fixed that, and I fixed the grades on Learn. So if you checked it and you got a 0 and you were wondering, and you're pretty sure you contributed, that should be fixed now. This is not to say you made a mistake per se, it's just I had an oversight not checking for erratic human behavior, which is always hard. One of the things they say is hardest about data science is counting things. Like it's really hard to count things. You all probably know this because countries around the world are like doing a completely terrible job counting COVID cases. Everyone counts them differently. No, people keep changing how they count them. It's really hard to match things to things. So all of these are like legitimate data science problems, one of which bit a few of you for a few hours, but it should be fixed now. Any questions before I get started with the analysis, like the code along for today? What are the 2 deadlines for proposals? So you have a deadline that's due Tuesday. We're going to give you feedback. The reproposal deadline is simply an optional one. If you want to improve your proposal, you can submit again for the later deadline. And I'll say more about that tomorrow at the workshop. It is me giving you a carrot giving you an opportunity to even increase that proposal mark so that I can be pretty blunt when I review your proposals. And the reason why I would like to do that is because then your projects can be a lot better. So I don't want to feel like, oh, it looks like these people have really put in an effort, let's just let them slide. I'd rather say, no, this might actually send you down the wrong path and you can have a much harder time later. But I see you've put in the effort. If you make these adjustments now, you can earn back a few more points, and that's basically the incentive for you to do a little bit better. But that second re-proposal deadline is simply an optional one. If your team decides you're happy with what you have, then you can simply ignore that second one. Kind of hoping some of you will, because otherwise I have twice the work. Okay, where can you, okay, if you have individual questions about like a specific, so as I said, if you have questions about like what went wrong, just go review your repository, go review your stuff. And then if you have still questions about that, we can talk about those individual cases later, but I don't want to open up on a recorded session, especially anybody's marks, and go through them here. Where can you see the marks? Can somebody answer? Where can we see the marks? You can unmute yourself and say it. Does anyone know where you can see your marks? On Learn. Okay, maybe Joy already said it. So the feedback, the verbal feedback is on a GitHub issue, but I do also record them for like official purposes on Learn. Yes, the proposal does contribute to your project. Otherwise, people wouldn't necessarily do as good a job on their proposal. I'm going to skip over a couple of these where it seems like individual questions, and you can ask them again later. Are there any guidelines for the types of questions? And yes, so on the project outline, I have actually given you some ideas for data sets that you can use. Otherwise, and regarding the size of the data set, the size of the data set is there, but I've also given you some data set options that you can choose. Otherwise, you're going to kind of, the proposal stage is basically for you to get creative. So I don't want to say, here are some sample projects from last year, because the result of that is going to be, you know, a substantial chunk of the teams do similar projects. You write your proposal in your GitHub repository for your project, just like everything else. All right, so I skipped over a couple like I got this score type questions, but I'm happy to address them at the end of the session as well. All right, so let's go ahead and share the screen. And let's do this. I'm also going to, as this is firing, oh no, that's not the one. We're doing code along 05. So I'm going to go ahead and start this. And while that's starting, I'm going to make my cursor a little bit bigger. That's not the right one. Okay. All right, so let's go ahead and open up this document, and I am going to say I want to view my results in the viewer pane and net this once. So the data set we're looking at comes from our package called UK Baby Names, which I maintain and I have to update actually. So it's not, the data doesn't come up to 2020. So that needs an update soon, but we do have data up to 2017. So what we have here is kind of the most popular baby names in the UK based on official registries of people born, okay? And so we're going to use these two data sets. I'm going to skip over this first chunk talking about it, but I'm going to come back to it a little bit later when we start looking at the plot. So let's leave that for now. So we have two data sets in this R package. One of them is called UK baby names, which is basically the full baby name kind of like list for 1996 to 2017 from the Office of National Statistics. And we also have a rankings data as well, which is more of a longitudinal data set containing the top 100 baby girl and baby boy names. Okay. So one of the things is these particular data sets, if I just load these packages and type the name of the data set, it happens to be the same as the package. These particular data sets in the package are data frames, but are not tables. So we have mentioned in the course kind of materials that tables are basically tidyverse's interpretation of data frames. They're exactly the same thing, but when you print them, they don't print out so big. They only print out the first 10 rows for you, so they're a little bit easier to inspect. That's I think the biggest distinction between tables and kind of pure data frames in R. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start by converting both of these to tables so that we can see the data as we're used to seeing them, where it only prints out the first 10. And if I wanted to see the rest, I can take a look at it this way. I'm going to make a comment as an aside that this, for example, on its own would not be a great choice for a project data set. Why? Because it has too few columns. Now I can imagine supplementing this for other things. So we have a year data set. Maybe your proposal could say something like, we're also going to get some other data from some other national statistics for the same years and merge them in. Like then we might be coming up to something a little bit more reasonable. But if a project proposal said, this is what we want to do, we just want to look at names over time, these are the only variables we have, I would say that would probably not fly. I'm only saying probably because perhaps somebody would come up with something quite interesting to do with this, where it seemed like it's not just limited by the number of variables, but that's usually less likely. Okay. Okay. So let's take a look at what we have. Using this data set, we can, for example, take a look at how popular a particular name has been over the years. So what I did is I looked at the first names in our class, and here are the top names. And I haven't put together, so there's some Alexes and some Alexanders as well who go by Alex. So if we had put all of those together, we would have actually had 7 of them. But I wanted to pick the ones that were kind of like what showed up on the official records for this. So we have 4 Alexes, 3 Jameses, 3 Sophies, and 2 Toms. Everything else was 2 or fewer. So what we can do is we can see how did these names do over the years, okay? So I want to talk you through how I did this because there are a variety of ways that we can do it. But I have 4 names that I want to consider for the rest of my analysis, right? So what I've done is I've created a new vector called popular IDS names, okay? And I've created a vector using the C function that stands for concatenate. These are all character strings, so I've put them in quotation marks. So instead of writing these names directly in my code, I chose to create this vector and then refer to it. One is not necessarily more correct than the other. I very well could have just done the upcoming code like this. But I find that if you can refactor your work into something like this, it makes it a little bit easier to maintain your work. This might especially be true for your projects where you'll do a little bit of work, then you'll come back to it and you'll work with your team to do a bit more. Now, if we decide that there was an error in how we counted the names, or if we decided to go by preferred name as opposed to given name and wanted to change what popular names are defined as, we would only need to change it in one place, and that change would propagate through to the rest of our code. Versus if I had used this in my code in various places in my code, this vector definition, I'd have to change it in multiple places. So you want to write code in a way where it makes it harder for you to, it makes it easier for you to maintain what you're doing. So let's go ahead and take a look at this plot. So this is what our plot looks like. So for the 4 names, it looks like Alex and Sophie appear for both female and male, but James and Tom don't appear for female. Maybe that makes sense, right? Those particular names make sense. So here we have a plot of how these names have done over the years. So what does a higher rank mean, you think? Does it mean that name is more popular or less popular? Less popular, right? So here it looks like the Alex is increasing over the years, but what is increasing is its rank, which actually means the name Alex for females is going down, like the popularity is going down as opposed to going up. So what would be one way to represent this a little bit better in our analysis, you think? How could the visualization we present be a little bit more in line? Right, we would probably want to revert that axis, right? So how would we revert that axis? So I'm going to kind of walk you through my process of doing this too, because I don't remember off the top of my head. So we have a ggplot, reverse y-axis, maybe. Reverse order of discrete y-axis. That's not entirely, it's not discrete. We have a numerical variable. Reverse and change limit of axis maybe is a bit more likely. So let's open that up. I usually like scrolling down to the answer. So scale y reverse, and then they change the limits to be 0 to 10. Let's try it. Scale y reverse. Will this work? So we can copy our code and say we want to do, whoops, scale y reverse. Oh, it says object popular IDS names not found. Why is that happening? Because I actually didn't run this code in my console yet. I just knitted my document, so I need to run everything that comes before it so that that popular IDS names variable is now, or object is now available in my environment. And then I run it. Okay, there we go. So we actually have the y-axis reversed, right? And I didn't have to give it specific limits. It kind of took care of it for me. So now we can see a little bit better that popularity of Alex as a female name has gone down over the years. The rest of them have stayed constant. But one of the other things that bugging me about this visualization is, why does this y-axis go to 6,000? I mean, there seems to be absolutely no data here. So let's try to first understand, like, why is it going up to that number? How would I go about finding out? Does anyone have any ideas? So once again, our UK baby names data frame looks something like this. We have information on year, sex, name, N is the popularity, though we're not using that column right now, and the rank of the name. How many rows are in the data frame? We have 254,889 rows. So that's over here. Count the names. But what we have plotted on the y-axis is the rank, not the count. Look at the highest rank, right? We want to look at the highest rank. So let's go ahead and try to figure out the highest rank. So, and we don't care about the highest of all the names, but we do care about it for the ones that are the most, like, that are among the popular IDS names. So let's go ahead and take a look. So here's a filtered data set for just those 4 names, right? And what we might want to do is we might say, let's go ahead and I want to see what the highest rank available in my data set is. So maybe James has the answer. What might I do in order to get that number? There are a variety of ways I could approach this. If if we want to know the highest rank, what are some things that I could try? We could look for the maximum for rank. So I could say, summarize this data set to give me max rank, maximum of rank. And that number is 55785. So I have one different than yours, James. But I don't know who it belongs to. So Emma, that's a good approach. We know that number. So there must be a point here, at least a point. That's 5785, but I don't know how many. So let's try Eleanor. So we might want to do an arrange of rank. Okay. So now we can see, oh, but if I do an arrange, it starts with the first, with the number 1, but I'm more interested in the highest. So we want to do a descending order, right? Okay. In fact, there were in the year 2016 on record, 3 females with the name, so 3 baby girls with the name James. And so that was a pretty low likelihood of something happening. So that was 50, the rank is pretty low. So it must be that in here, there's like there is perhaps, wait, let's think. So there's not even a dot on this plot for this, right? So what we have done is we've said we want to make a line plot, right? A line plot. Can you draw a line through a single point? That's not really defined. You need at least 2 points to draw a line. So if we only had one James, like James appearing only once on the female side, that would be a single point and it wouldn't be represented on our plot. So what we could probably try to do is, I'm going to copy this code for a second and say, in addition to geom line, also give me geom point. And let's see, that allows us to see that individual point. So see, we can see that there is that point down here with a really low rank for 1 observation for James. So how might we go about fixing this? Now, there are 2 ways of fixing such a thing. One would be to say, I'm just going to put an arbitrary limit and say, limit my y-axis to 0 to 2000 or something like that. What I would recommend is, instead of hard coding a number like that, would be to actually make it clear in your code what you're doing. So we want to filter this out, but we might also want to say, I'm going to take out that 1 James, because I can't actually make a line with that, and say filter such that maybe we can say name is not equal to, maybe, let's see, name is equal to James and rank and sex is F. And if I want to filter this out, maybe I can write this condition and then say I don't want it. So I use the exclamation point here. So now we've basically filtered out that one thing. Now, the reason why I wanted to walk through this with you is that, now let's imagine a situation where you're working on your project. It's a collaborative project. You're working with others, right? Or you're reviewing anybody else's code. And they've made a fix like this, but say they had done it in a way, not the way that we wrote it, but they had done it in a way, maybe they said, limit the rank 5785. Or limit your plot up to 2000 or something like that, and hadn't left any comments in their code. The next person reading that would have no idea why that was done in the first place. So a better way of doing it would be to then add a comment here, say, take out single James in females, for example. Okay, something like this. So when you come back to it, you know why you made that change. All right. So now we can see kind of the trajectory of these, and I can take the points out now if I want, so that I just have the line plots. All right. Now I want to talk a little, any questions about what we've done so far? All right, so I want to talk a little bit about coding style. All right, so as we analyze the data further, we're going to give a few more pointers on coding style. So let me go ahead and knit this document. I wanted to share this one quote with you from Hadley Wickham, who basically leads the projects, like is the lead developer for the Tidyverse packages. All right. So this is a quote from him where he says, good coding style is like correct punctuation. You can manage without it, but it sure makes things easier to read. So one of the nice things, but also the things that sometimes make life harder about R is that it will still run your code if your code isn't styled properly or indented properly. That's a nice thing because it's like a little bit more permissive, but it does mean that it puts it on you to be more careful with your styling. So let's go through a few examples here. Oh, and also we'll use the Tidyverse style guide. So next week, along with our reading, I'll add an optional link to, or I think I actually did this week as an optional link to that. I don't expect you to read the whole style guide. I really wanted to give it to you as a reference, but you can see kind of the style guide. It's a nice one to refer to. I don't know why it's not opening it. It's because of my giant cursor. Nothing is working. So let's open it up here. Especially the analyses portion is what I referred to as opposed to the packages. So the latter part of the style guide is about if you're writing R packages, which is beyond the scope of what we're doing in this class. But it looks like a lot, but each of these chapters is very short to read, and it's a good one to refer back to as you write code. And I think I mentioned this last time or something. I can't remember exactly what session I mentioned it, but it is not just some made up style guide. It's a very commonly used style guide for both R developers, but also the style guide Google uses as well. So you can imagine then a lot of like developers end up using the guide that Google uses as well. So what you're learning is like pretty widely applicable. So file names, we want to avoid spaces. So for example, if you're saving a file, you would want to have something like dashes or underscores as opposed to spaces in your file names. And this also applies to chunk labels as well. So R Markdown will let you get away with having a space here, but I recommend that you don't do that, that you actually include the dashes or underscores or something like that. Because when you actually knit the code, remember, when you actually knit your document, remember that this additional folder is generated with your images, and the names of these images basically come from the code chunk labels. Okay, so that ends up being, the chunk label ends up being a file name ultimately if it was generating some plots. And it makes it a lot easier to then refer back to these plots throughout your analysis, the fact that they don't have the spaces on whatever operating system you're on. As an additional benefit to you, the code that I run to check your code assumes that you don't have these spaces in there. So if you do, it actually craps out and then we'll say you don't have it right. Okay. Object names, we want to separate object names with underscores as opposed to dots or something else. So for object names, use underscores to separate and use all lowercase. So that's what we call snake case. Make them informative but short. So what I've done here is I've said I've taken the UK baby names data set and filtered for year 2017. So we're only looking at the 2017 data, okay? I would name that UK baby names underscore 2017. Not dot, because we said to use underscores, but also not two. Like people tend to do this a lot. They do UK baby names 2, 3, 4 as they make other versions of it, because the next time you come back and refer to your code, you have no idea what that 2 represents. Another common thing I see is something like UK baby name subset, but like subset of what? It's more informative to say what you have subsetted for than to say you just subsetted. And then this one, the last one, is actually pretty good if you think about it. It's very obvious what it is, but it's so freaking long that every time you write it, then you're going to have to write that name out. And every single additional letter you write is an opportunity for a typo that's going to appear like a frustrating bug in your code. For spacing, Always put a space before and after your operators, so your equals and your kind of your pipe operators and whatnot as well. So I'll actually make this bad one even badder, because I've certainly seen this in some of your code. So let's go ahead and do this. You want to let your code breathe a little bit, okay? It's very, even though this second one does run like this, it makes it a lot harder to read the code. So you want to do spacing just like you would in regular English as well. So for example, in regular English, we would put a space after a comma. That's what you should have in your code as well. Now, some of this might feel tedious, and it is meant to be a little bit tedious. The reason, though, is that if you're using a consistent style amongst people you're working with, it makes it so much easier to collaborate. So the reason, for example, why I said there is a Tidyverse style guide and there is a Google style guide is not because there are a bunch of OCD people who just want people to follow rules. It's because this is meant to make it easier for teams to be working together, so they don't have to talk about this minutia amongst themselves and decide, shall we put spaces after commas or not? If there's a style guide that's been vetted, that is being used by others, you can simply stick to it, and then you don't have to have that conversation yourself. For ggplots, we want to always end the lines with a plus, as opposed to what I call ggplot novellas that look a little bit more like this. It makes it easier to read your code. It makes it also easier to learn from this code as well. So when you think about it, we've talked about ggplots being created in layers. So if you have your code in layers, it's a lot easier to map what you're doing to what you're seeing. And also it makes it easier to debug things as well. So let's say that I want to get rid of my lines to see, is that a look I want? What I can do here is simply comment out this particular line and then create my plot again. So maybe let's go ahead and do this. Oh, let's run everything to here. So now I don't have my lines on my plot. So I can see the effect of not having the geom line or having the geom line a lot easier this way than if I had my code like this and I had to take it out and put it back in just to test things out. So there's an ease to, this also makes it easier for you to iterate on your code as well. Another one is about long lines. So here we go. We want to limit the code. So this is not your narrative, but your code to 80 characters per line. This is a very archaic measure, but it's one that's used commonly. So that's why we're sticking to it. 80 characters if we were printing out our code. Thank God we're not doing that. But if we were, that's what would fit on a line. And that's where that number 80 comes from. You'll also see that on our Studio Cloud, you have this like guiding line for yourself. So you can use that to guide things. So when you write these ggplot novellas, then they definitely go over the 80 character line, versus if you are actually sticking to line breaks at most 80 characters, then your code can be formatted a lot nicer. This style guideline it works both ways, but it's what we recommend you do, even though you won't see the difference of making a mistake of this, at least in terms of what we're going to cover in this course. For assignment, we want you to use the assignment operator, which is basically the less than sign followed by a dash, makes that arrow as an assignment operator, as opposed to this one, where we have an equal sign. We use the equal sign for kind of creating objects within our functions or for arguments, but when we're creating an object that's supposed to live in our environment, we basically want to use the assignment operator. The biggest reason why I brought this assignment operator up is that you'll always see me using it, but when you look for code online, you might see other usages as well. Quotes, use double quotes as opposed to single quotes, except in this case. So let me go ahead and show you what this plot looks like. So this is all the Judes throughout the years. So here we go. What I wanted to do was to have my plot title have quotation marks in it in my text. So I can't actually do like 2 layers of quotation marks because R would get confused with what's going on there. So it's in this case that you might use the single quotes outside of that. But otherwise, for defining your character strings, we want to use double quotes. Okay. Any questions about the style? I have one more thing in terms of the code chunk that we skipped on top, and then I'm going to ask you for ideas for what else we should do with the data.
I also saw, I can't remember where it was, but somewhere using like backticks as to enclose
so like this
text. Yeah.
So this can happen. So let's create something where that might happen. So I'm going to create a data frame. Okay, and I'm going to say that so let's say this is our data frame, okay? This is usually where you might have seen this. Tibble will print them out like this. If you happen to have spaces in your variable names, it will use the backticks as opposed to a single quote or a double quote. So that might be where you've come across it.
Oh, okay. So it's not like using quotes to make it a string or anything.
No, it's basically saying this is not so much a character string as a variable name. So it's trying to make that it's trying to distinguish them between the two.
Thanks.
Mm-hmm. Other questions about the style? Okay, so let me show you guys one more thing about the style. So here, let's take one that was kind of bad. Maybe let's take, what was bad? Maybe let's make this one even worse. How about that? I'm going to try to get rid of like a bunch of the spaces. So do a bunch of stuff that we told you not to do. Okay. And then what I'm going to do is, I hope this works on our Studio Cloud, but we're going to find out. So I'm going to select this code, and then I'm going to go to my add-ins. Then I'll say style selection. Sure. It asks me if I want to install a package. Let's see if it'll do it. Let's try again. It's probably trying to install it, but just not giving me any sort of feedback. Yeah, it is running some code to install that package. How about I let that install it, talk to, oh, here we go. Oh, why don't you want to work? It's right. Here we go. Can you do it for me? Okay, so let's go back and try it again. It just needed you to like agree to something. So here's the broken code, or in terms of the style, but you can basically use this add-in to style it properly for you. So if you write some code and maybe you were just like trying to figure some stuff out, and then you're like, okay, I finally figured this out. I know this doesn't look the way it's supposed to, but I don't feel like putting in the spaces and like putting in the line breaks one by one. Or sometimes you're working with a collaborator and you pull down their changes and you're like, I'm really thankful my teammate worked on this, but look at their code. Now I have to go through and kind of indent it and whatever. You can basically highlight it and use the add-in and say style the selection, or you can style the whole file if you want. And then it will make the changes for you. So there's an automated way of doing this as well. So there's really no reason not to kind of stick to it. Now I want to show you one more thing, and this is not something I need you to care about so much, but I will try to put this on your template. So I wanted to show you what it is. I'm going to take this chunk out for a second and knit my document. Okay. So when I knit my document, you can see my plots by default have a certain size, and you can see that they're like a little bit fuzzy to read. And what we can do is we can change by default what size each of your plots should be. also the resolution at which they're printed. So we can tell the engine that's basically running the code underneath, which is the based off of the knitter package, to say all of my figures, I want their widths to be 6 inches. I want the aspect ratio to be 0.618. Does anyone know the significance of that number? So if width is 6, the height will be 6 times 0.618. So it's basically the golden ratio. So it's supposed to be a visually appealing ratio. Yeah. And I'm going to increase the kind of the pixels per inch. And I'm going to make the width of my plots about 80% of my width as opposed to 100%. So I'll just knit the document one more time with this, and you'll see that it's going to affect every single one of my plots. And they seem a little bit more legible. The characters are like a little bit bigger, similar to this font size of everything else. So what I'll do going forward is, for your homework assignments and stuff, I'll leave this up top. But always remember that if you had a plot where maybe you had like a bunch of facets and you needed to change them, we know how to change the width and height of things for an individual chunk. But this way, when you knit your document, things look a little bit more visually pleasing and the plots are a little bit easier to read. Okay, so this is a global option, and you can always change individual options for your plots by either writing things like fig width or fig height here, or remember, you can click on the gear icon and change the figure sizes. Okay, so anything else we want to look at in the baby names data set? Anything else come to mind? Nobody's curious. Anybody want to look what your name, how your name has done over the years? Okay, when was the last person called Gary born? Good question. Let's see. When was the last person called Gary born? Now, here's the question, and let's try to think about how we can phrase this question a little bit better first, okay? So when was the last person called Gary born? I mean, probably the answer is like a second ago, right? Potentially. But when we say last person, what do we mean? The oldest or the youngest? Youngest person with the name Gary. Okay, so in this data set, right? In this data set, what is the birth year of the youngest person named Gary? Does that sound like what we want to answer? Is that what you meant, Sammy? So remember that I'm saying in this data set because we're going to be bounded by what we can say based off of this data set. So I'll give this chunk label, young Gary. So let's start with UK baby names. So we want to definitely filter for name is Gary. And whenever I'm constructing these pipelines, what I do is, like, as soon as I think of something, I just run it. It costs you £0 to run code. So you might as well just run it and see what it looks like. Now we want the youngest person. So we want to arrange the year in which order? Ascending or descending? Descending. So let's go ahead and do arrange in descending order year 2017, which is basically how kind of how up to date this data is as well. So in the year 2017, there were 26 people with the name Gary. Isn't that crazy? It seems like a very low number, but and so probably there are younger ones. We just don't have data on that. So that's why I preface this with in this data set as well. And that's the sort of kind of wording you want to be paying attention to as you're working on your projects. But it's a good idea to just like throw something out and then try to kind of iterate on it, do your best. And then after that, you know, maybe in the proposal, I might give you a little bit of feedback on making it better as well. What's going on in 2009? I don't know. What happened in 2009 in the UK that made the name Gary so popular? Not sure. Okay, any other questions we want to answer from the data? Who is the singer Gary? I don't know who this person is. Gary Barlow. I'm like a little bit hesitant to Google any one of these things on a recorded thing where I'm sharing my screen. I know better than to trust 19-year-olds. Okay, and clearly David is closer to your age because he's saying things that I don't understand. So I'll let you guys figure that one out. Okay, any other questions about the data set or anything else? Yeah, we can do Ava. Do you want to take a look to see how Ava has changed over the years? Let's take a look at this one, except maybe we can do for the name Ava. So how did we define Jude? So I'm going to go up and see how I had defined. So UK baby names, maybe we just filter for Ava, and then we say make a ggplot where the x-axis is the year, y-axis is the rank. Maybe we can do a color by sex in case there are both. And then our y-axis is rank of Ava. And then let's make this for Ava. Let's see. Far fewer and fewer over the years, and only females according to this. How has Alexander reduced while Alex has increased for name given at birth? Oh yeah, that's right. Alex is unisex, so that would explain it. All right. Any questions about anything else from the data set or anything about the class? You're right, rank is going down, so we should have reverted this. How did we do that before? Scale Y reverse. There we go. So it is getting more popular. I apologize. Does your name show up? Let's see. Yeah, it does. Average growing ratio of the rank over years for a name. So what do you mean by average growing ratio? So maybe we could look at how it changes over the years. Not sure. I'm gonna run out of time. So I'm gonna let you answer that, Jan, how in terms of what you mean, but we might come back to it. You guys can also keep playing with this. Let me go ahead and knit this. So I'll post the recording along with our markdown file as I have it. And then the project is there for you to keep playing with as well. So any questions about any course stuff, like more general questions as opposed to something about your individual work that we should answer while the recording is still going on? Do quizzes each week count overall? Yeah, quizzes are a portion of your grade. Okay. So your individual lab grade is on Learn, as I said in the feedback. The proposal weight that's all outlined in the project description. So if you scroll down to the marking it gives you the various weights for the components for the project. It's not a huge percent, but. Is the reading mandatory? That's a good question, Rasmus. So, I mean, I label them required in the sense that it is the material we're covering as opposed to something tangentially relevant for people who maybe like to read a little bit more. I think whether the reading is mandatory for you or not depends on your learning style, really. I know that some people prefer the videos as opposed to the reading. And some people have a harder time paying attention to videos. This was something I would say last year as well, if I had like assigned any additional videos, but now it's a little bit harder, I think, for students to be able to say, I have a hard time paying attention to videos. I mean, it's a very valid thing to say, but unfortunately the situation we are in necessitates that there are videos. So I would say they're a great supplement. And most importantly, if you are, once you, let's say, watch the videos and you're working on an assignment, you're like, how do I do X? I think it's a lot easier to refer back to the reading than the videos. Because in the videos, even though I have the chapter markers, it's a little bit hard to find what was where without watching the whole thing. So it's a lot easier to go to one of those books and just do a Control F on a keyword that you're looking for and maybe read around that. Another thing in that same vein, I will say, is that this is even like how I use these materials, along with the videos, I always post the slides that go with the videos as well. So if you're looking for something, you might kind of scroll through to see what you were looking for here and then refer back to that point in the video. I think it's a lot easier to scroll through slides than a video, I think. So I think I would say they're a good supplement, but I'm not grading you on did you do the reading. It's just sometimes your assignment might have something that's coming out of a reading as opposed to directly out of a video. But it's not like we have exams in this course, right? Everything is open book ultimately, so you can always refer to them as you go as well. I do think the exploratory data analysis chapter for this week is worthwhile to read, though, I will say that, because it really walks you through the process of putting together a project, which will be helpful for you. All right, then we're gonna, I'll stop the sharing and I'll stop the recording as well.